Welcome to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, a podcast dedicated to helping modern-day believers live out the teachings of the first century church. This podcast is part of the teaching ministry of Dr. David K. Bernard. Dr. Bernard has dedicated his life to studying the Bible and helping believers apply its message to their daily lives. In Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, Dr. Bernard answers your questions about what the Bible teaches and how those teachings apply to everyday life. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Several verses in the New Testament describe Jesus as sitting or standing at God's right hand. Probably one of the most frequently referenced is Acts 7:55, where Stephen is being stoned and he looks up into heaven as he's being murdered, and he sees the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Now, if we take these verses at face value, don't they indicate some sort of separation or distinction between Jesus and God? I mean, after all, how can Jesus, the Son of God, and God the Father be one and the same if Stephen really saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God?
This is a very common question, and it's a good question. So to answer it scripturally, there are a couple things we need to note first. First of all, Jesus Christ was a real human being in every way just like us, except for sin. So the Bible, the New Testament particularly, does make a distinction between God and Jesus. It's not a distinction of two divine persons. There's only one God, and there's no distinction of persons in his eternal essence. Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And there are many other statements of the Bible. For example, in Isaiah, God says, I'm alone, there's none beside me, there's none like me, there's none before me, there's none after me. When I created the universe, I stretched forth the heavens alone. I spread the earth by myself. I will not give my glory to another. So the Bible is full of statements that God is one. However, Jesus was a real human being. So in order to protect the authentic, genuine humanity of Jesus, the New Testament speaks of the Father and the Son, or God and Jesus. And here is a classic example. So that's the first point I would like to make. The second point is that God is a spirit, John 4:24. In fact, John 1:18 says, no man has seen God at any time. Now notice that statement was written after the incarnation, after the death, burial, resurrection, life, ascension of Jesus. So even after the disciples had seen Jesus for years, John was able to write, no one has seen God at any time. That's talking about God's spirit. So God as a spirit is invisible. So when you say Jesus is standing at the right hand of God, or Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, you must understand it as a metaphor. You cannot understand it as a literal description of bodies. If you do, you have the question, how can you see God? God's a spirit, God's invisible. Is Jesus sitting or is he standing? Or does he just change position every so often? It's been a couple thousand years since he ascended to heaven. Can he walk around? Or does he have to sit there? Or maybe he's on the right hand. Maybe it's a giant right hand and he's standing on the right hand. You can easily see this becomes absurd when you try to make it a physical positioning of bodies. Then also, if you have two different bodies, in what meaningful sense do you have one God? Any normal person, if I showed you a picture of an old man and a young man, if that be the case, sitting here, would they say, oh, there's one person? No, they would say, that's one God there. No, that's two. And then another question is, well, if there's a Trinity, as this discussion leads to, well, where's the third person? Is he absent? So when you get to heaven, are you going to see an old man, a young man, and a dove? Is the third person an animal? In Revelation 5, it talks about the lamb. So is the second person actually going to be a man, or is it going to be an animal? So when you try to interpret these verses in a physical sense, you quickly go to absurdity. So if God is a spirit, God is invisible, and God is omnipresent. Psalm 139 says God is everywhere. So where would God's right hand be? If Jesus, we do believe, has a physical body, even now, he's in a glorified physical body somewhere transcending this universe. I think his spirit is everywhere, but He will come back to earth in his glorified body. We will actually see him. But if there is that one body of God, which God has chosen, well, where would be the right hand of God so that this body could go? Where would he go? I mean, is it, on the earth or in heaven? So the point is, we need to look at this as a metaphorical expression. And sure enough, in the languages of the Bible, both the Hebrew of the Old Testament, the Greek of the New Testament, there is a metaphor much like we have in English. When we say, this is my right-hand man, we say, this is the person that executes my will. This is the person that does most of my work. This is the person I rely on heavily. And the reason is 90% of people are naturally right-handed. So instinctively, a right-handed person thinks of their right hand as having power. And if you are right-handed, of course, if you're left-handed, the opposite is true, but the point is still there. When you try to write with your left hand, or you try to throw with your left hand, or you try to fight with your left hand, you quickly feel awkward. You can't get the job done. You feel foolish, weak, helpless. But if you can use your right hand, you feel strong. So that's why it's a metaphor. The right hand is the position of power and authority. And also in ancient times, the right hand position, like of a king, is the position of honor. If you sit at the right hand, and you see this in the New Testament, then you're seated in the position of honor. So actually what we're saying is the visible man Jesus is at the right hand of the invisible Spirit of God. In other words, the visible man Jesus has been invested with all the power and authority of the one true God. And why is that so important? Well, in Christ's earthly ministry, he just appeared to be an ordinary man. Of course, to people with eyes of faith, they saw him do miracles, they heard him speak, they realized he's more than just a man. But just to the average person, he would look like a typical man. But after he ascended to heaven, he assumed the position of glory. So when Stephen was dying, he saw the glorified Christ. He didn't just see him as an ordinary man walking around on earth. To draw the contrast, the Apostle John, on a human level, was a close friend of Jesus. So close, he leaned up against his breast at the Last Supper. And when Jesus was talking about somebody is going to betray me, Peter reached over to John and said, ask him who he's talking about, because John was at the closest position. And on a human level, if anybody could get something out of Jesus, no doubt it'd be John. Okay, so that's how close they were. But in Revelation chapter 1, when this same Apostle John saw the ascended Christ, he fell down at his feet as if he were dead. He was so overwhelmed by the glory of God. Hey, what happened? You walked with him for 3 years. You ate lunch with him. You leaned up against him. It's no big deal. You're his best friend. But now you see him and you just fall out because he saw him with the glory of God, the right hand position. He saw him as God manifest in the flesh. So if you read Acts 7 very carefully, it does not say Stephen saw two bodies. It doesn't even say Stephen saw God and Stephen saw Jesus. It says Stephen saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. So I would say Stephen saw this cloud of glory, which was a manifestation of God. You can't directly see God's invisible spirit, but God could reveal his glory, as in the Old Testament. And then the way I picture it, in the middle of this cloud of glory, I imagine Stephen looking up and he sees this cloud of glory, obviously the glory of God. But as he looks closely, he sees one man emerging out of it. And that's Jesus. He can recognize him. But it's not just Jesus as he appeared on earth. It's Jesus as God.